The sun was just beginning to filter through the dense forest canopy when Carlos Charlie, Ramos Salgado, and Daniela Herrera Lujan, both carrying canvas backpacks and cameras hanging from their necks, boarded a white Toyota pickup truck from the central plaza of Ocosingo. It was 6:25 in the morning. The weather was humid, the air was dense with low-lying fog, and community radio had just announced power outages in some communities in the south of the municipality. Both photographers, one independent and the other sent by the photo PR agency, disappeared that day without leaving any trace other than a record in the hotel log of the Los Laureles Hotel, where they had slept the night before. Since then, silence became the only witness. Carlos had been investigating the forced evictions of Celtic communities on the outskirts of the La Candona jungle for months. Daniela joined weeks earlier after an anonymous complaint was received by the editorial office. Several indigenous children had been expelled from their lands with machetes, and there were rumors that plainclothes armed forces were involved. What was supposed to be a brief cover turned into a dangerous mission. They carried 2 SLR cameras, several rolls of Kodachrome film, and a notebook where they wrote down routes, names, times, and key phrases. The last time they were seen was leaving the municipal market after buying sweet bread, atole, and 2 bottles of water. Witnesses recalled that Carlos was carrying a black case slung over his shoulder and that Daniela was wearing a faded blue shirt, her hair tucked under a beige cap. They were in a hurry, said a fruit vendor years later, but they looked determined as if they knew what they were going to find. That morning they took the road east, skirting coffee plantations and small ranches. Their destination was a Celtic community called New Horizon, which was only accessible by a secondary path. According to the notebook found decades later, that area had been marked with red asterisks next to the names of community leaders and notes about irregular patrol movements. At the entrance to the dirt road, a contact was waiting for them, a young farmer with a red cap whose identity was never verified. After a brief conversation, the 3 disappeared into the undergrowth. At 7:50 a.m., a neighbor herding cattle near the trailhead saw a green, unmarked pickup truck drive by with 2 armed men in the rear cab. "I also saw a camera dangling from one of their hands," he later said in a sworn statement. "But I didn't stop. Here in the mountains, he who looks too long never returns home." The hours passed without news. That night, neither Carlos nor Daniela returned to Ocoingo. The hotel receptionist noted it in her logbook. They didn't return for their things. Their belongings remained intact. A suitcase with clothes, previous negatives, a tape recorder with no batteries, and an open bus ticket to Tuxtla. 2 days passed, then a week. The photo PR agency sent an urgent message to the local authorities, but the response was slow, almost mechanical. The first official inquiries were opened 27 days after the disappearance. By then, silence had already covered everything. During the first months, the disappearance of Carlos and Daniela barely occupied a brief space in the state newspapers. In Mexico City, press issued an urgent bulletin accompanied by the most recent photographs of Daniela, with her serene face and intense eyes, and of Carlos, with a budding beard and an almost mocking smile. But in Chiapas, the reports vanished amid bureaucracy and fear. The folder's investigations were opened and closed without evidence. The case was filed under number 41-82, classified as a presumed disappearance for unknown reasons. The word disappearance was not yet recognized as a crime under Mexican law. There was no formal search, no brigades, no searches. The 1990s brought new conflicts, and the photographer's story was forgotten among so many other names lost in the jungle. Some of Carlos's colleagues continued investigating on their own, traveling to Ocoingo, speaking with communities and collecting testimonies, but witnesses disappeared or contradicted each other. The fear was palpable. In 1996, a freelance journalist found an incomplete copy of Carlos's field notebook in San Cristobal de las Casas, with some notes on routes and vehicle license plates. No one knew how it got there. It was handed over to the authorities, but it did not reactivate the case. Daniela's parents died in 2003. They died without knowing what had happened to their daughter. Her mother, suffering from Alzheimer's, repeated a single phrase as she looked at the framed photo. It wasn't an accident, it was silence. Carlos, meanwhile, left behind 2 younger brothers who for decades knocked on doors at human rights agencies, always with the same response: Without bodies, there is no crime. In 2011, the National Human Rights Commission issued a report on attacks on journalists in rural areas. The case of Carlos and Daniela was mentioned in a footnote, without details or follow-up. More than 3 decades passed. In 2017, a young journalism student from UNAM published an article titled, "Two Shadows in the Jungle." It was read by few, but it caught the attention of an anthropologist working in the Montes Azules Reserve. He had heard rumors of a place, an old abandoned logging road, where a couple from outsiders were once said to have been buried. There were no exact coordinates, only scattered stories among Lacandons, shepherds, and park rangers. Nothing concrete. In August 2021, a controlled fire caused the cleared some of the undergrowth on that same trail. A park ranger, picking through debris among charred roots and logs, stumbled upon a corner of waxed cloth, hardened by time. He carefully unearthed it. Inside was something no one expected: a waterproof canvas bag closed with a drawstring, its edges rotten from moisture. Inside were 2 undeveloped rolls of film, a worn notebook with illegible notes, and 2 press IDs stained with dried blood. The local police were notified, and this time for some reason that even the officials couldn't quite explain. The case wasn't filed. Perhaps it was the starkness of the images, perhaps the echo of a forgotten story, or perhaps simply because after 39 years, it was no longer possible to pretend it never happened. News of the discovery in the Montes Azules Biosphere Reserve first reached the halls of the public ministry in Palenque as a rumor. A park ranger, the same one who years earlier had reported illegal logging in the area, had found a sealed bag, half buried under old roots in Ceiba and Guarumbo, on a forgotten stretch of the old lumber trail, known locally as the Alligator Gap. The contents were disturbing: 2 rolls of Kodachrome photographic film, severely damaged by moisture but still recognizable in structure, a small notebook with a cover cracked by sun and rain, and 2 press credentials with legible names, although partially covered by what appeared to be dried blood. The discovery site was cordoned off by members of the National Guard the next day. A forensic team arrived from Tuxtla Gutierrez with orders to transport all the material to the state capital for analysis. Among the experts was Clara Medina Gonzalez, a specialist in wet paper restoration, who, upon examining the notebook, bluntly exclaimed, "This isn't trash, this is a war log." On its soaked pages, through a process of controlled humidification, words, numbers, and symbols slowly emerged, along with names of Celtic leaders, truck license plates without official logos, dates of night patrols, and in one corner, a phrase underlined twice: "Avoid the section between Palenque and Nuevo Horizonte, a hostile area." The notebook wasn't just a roadmap, it was proof. It contained cross-referenced data that coincided with forgotten reports from the 1980s, especially those linked to forced displacement and systematic disappearances in rural areas in northern Ocosingo. One of the names noted was that of Eustacio Salmeron Mendez, a local rancher mentioned in old reports as a chief of the region, with unofficial links to security forces. Another name written in more hasty handwriting was Cordero Utrompañado lamb, a word that comes from the word rural police between question marks. The identification of the Kodachrome rolls was even more revealing. After weeks of work in Lena's historical imaging laboratory, part of the material was developed. The images, although blurred by chemical decomposition, retained a terrifying clarity in some fragments. In one of them, a group of Celtic peasants could be clearly seen being forcibly removed from a flatbed truck without license plates. Another showed a burning house, with 3 human silhouettes in the background. In a third, frozen like a silent scream in time, a boy no more than 8 years old hugged his mother's fallen body, both illuminated by the flames of their destroyed home. In the bottom corner of the negative, the finger of the person holding the camera appeared to be shaking. The technicians also found a doubly shocking photograph. Captured from a low hill, a makeshift camp with white blankets and kneeling women could be seen. Next to them, a man wearing a balaclava and unofficial uniform was talking on the radio. The face was not clear, but the physical build and the partial insignia on the shoulder were reminiscent of the uniforms worn by the state's old rural police. The investigation was officially reopened on September 23, 2021. The original file was extracted from the dead archives at the government palace. They found it in an unlabeled box amidst cases of cattle, rustling, and agrarian disputes, was almost complete. Despite the dust, it contained the statements of two protected witnesses from 1982, who claimed to have seen a couple of strangers being detained in the Madeira Gap by armed men in an unmarked pickup truck. The witnesses' signatures were crossed out with a blue pen. The not applicable stamp appeared on each sheet. A new generation prosecutor, Jorge Arteaga Ruiz, was assigned to the case. Their first step was to reunite the original team of researchers, or what remained of them, but most had died or emigrated. Arteaga then decided to form an interdisciplinary team of forensic scientists, social anthropologists, investigative journalists, and transitional law experts. The objective was clear: to reconstruct the events and determine whether any perpetrators were still alive. The first line of investigation pointed directly to the region's cattle ranching bosses during the 1980s. Salmeron Mendez, the name most frequently mentioned, had died in 2020 of a heart attack while he was sleeping. He was never formally investigated. He owned at least 7 ranches distributed between Ocosingo and Altamirano, and his record included multiple complaints of dispossession, all of which were filed. It was he who, according to declassified intelligence reports, ordered the clearing of witnesses from the areas in conflict with indigenous peoples. But what changed the course of the investigation was an unexpected discovery. In one of the rolls of film, the face of a man with a mustache and dark glasses standing at the edge of a ditch appeared partially in focus. He was wearing a light-colored shirt and holding what appeared to be a shortwave radio. When compared with press records from the time, a journalist from the newspaper El Heraldo de Chiapas proposed a tempting identification. The man in the image could be Samuel Cordero Uter, then operational commander of the State Rural Police, the same man who appeared in Carlos's notebook years earlier. From that moment on, the case ceased to be a forensic reconstruction and became a hunt for names buried in silence. Samuel Cordero Utra's face, although aged and deformed by the passing decades, left no room for doubt. The image on the film, enlarged and subjected to morphological analysis by the Institute of Forensic Sciences, matched official photographs of the former commander taken in 1981 and 1983, when he led rural operations during the so-called agrarian pacification program. Unlike other people involved, Cordero was still alive. He resided discreetly on a ranch on the outskirts of Comitan. Under a barely changed identity, he had never been prosecuted. Despite multiple testimonies over the years, the case never prospered. On October 29, 2021, following an arrest warrant issued in the early hours of the morning, he was captured without resistance. He was 77 years old. He walked with a cane and said he didn't remember anything. "So many years, sir. I don't even dream anymore." Personal documents, still functional shortwave radios, and a rusty revolver were seized from his home. The initial questioning revealed gaps, but also eloquent silences. Cordero never denied knowing Eustacio Salmeron or having operated in the Montes Azules area. He only repeated one sentence: "Sometimes by obeying one becomes a shadow." Media pressure grew. Activists, journalists, and relatives of Daniela and Carlos demanded justice. In November, an anonymous source provided the prosecutor's office with a letter written by a certain Domingo Trejo Escalante, a former employee of Salmeron, confessing to his involvement in a crime that occurred in the jungle with 2 outsiders who were taking photos. In his official statement, Trejo recounted how, after receiving orders to scare the couple, he and 2 other men intercepted them on the trail, beat them, and handed Cordero over at a gap known as Turtle Pass. There, under the supervision of 2 armed commanders, they were interrogated and then executed. The burial was immediate in a grave finished between roots. Trejo guided the experts to that site. On December 3, 2021, human remains consistent with a young man and woman were unearthed in a mossy clearing, along with camera fragments, a rusty St. Christopher medal, and pieces of blue cloth. Genetic tests compared with samples from relatives confirmed the identity of Carlos and Daniela. They had been there for 39 years, under layers of silence, mud, and jungle. The entire country reacted. The Ministry of the Interior acknowledged for the first time that this was a state crime covered up by local authorities. In a symbolic ceremony in San Cristobal de las Casas, One of the most powerful photographs found in the scrolls was revealed. Such a child crying with his forehead stained with dirt, hugging his mother in front of a burning hut. That image went viral with a simple phrase. The shot was not with a bullet, but with light. Cordero was sentenced to 40 years in prison for aggravated homicide, forced disappearance, and obstruction of justice. Trejo, for his collaboration, received 30 years without the right to reduction. Salmeron and Valinas, now deceased, were declared morally responsible in a public ceremony at the state Congress, where plaques bearing their names and the legend were placed. The power that conceals is part of the crime. Daniela and Carlos received posthumous honors as defenders of the truth. Their bodies were returned to their families and buried in the San Cristobal Civil Cemetery amid hundreds of candles and prayers. The Carlos and Daniela Center for Journalists in the Field opened in March of 2023. At the entrance, a black marble plaque repeats his mother's words. For showing the truth, they were silenced. By his light, we speak today. The legal proceedings initiated against Samuel Cordero Utrilla in early January 2022 represented not only the reopening of a forgotten case, but also the exposure of a network of complicity that had operated with impunity for decades in the Ocosingo region. The initial hearing was brief but dense. The public prosecutor's office presented material evidence, developed photographs, documents found in the waterproof case, notes from Carlos's field notebook, Trejo Escalante's sworn statements, and finally forensic reports confirming the genetic match between the remains and the photographer's relatives. Samuel Cordero arrived at the simple courtroom on wheels. He was wearing a gray sweater, his face aged and his gaze sunken, not out of regret, but rather out of resignation. His defense attorney attempted to discredit the testimony, citing unreliability due to the passage of time and a media campaign without legal basis. However, Judge Javier Avila, known for his firmness in cases of human rights violations, ordered immediate pretrial detention. The argument was compelling. Crimes against humanity do not expire, and the jungle never forgot. The exhumation of the bodies had been only the beginning. The forensic anthropologists involved in the process, coordinated by the Mexican legal anthropology team, conducted a thorough study of the bones, clothing remains, and recovered objects. Daniela had a fracture at the base of the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. Carlos had 2 broken ribs and an injury to his left ulna. There were no projectiles. The cause of death was classified as severe head trauma caused by a blunt object, according to the opinion issued on January 15. Both bodies showed signs of having been buried hastily, without proper tools, wrapped only in plant fiber blankets that still retained traces of dried blood and clay soil. One of the most significant finds was a partially burned Nikon FG camera with an inscription on the base that read, "For Danny with CR light." The roll inside that chamber was unrecoverable, but the object itself became symbolic evidence of the human bond that united them beyond work. Some journalists suggested that Carlos and Daniela were in a personal relationship, although there was never any public confirmation. The truth is that their personal diaries, kept by their families, showed a deep affection, a confidence forged in adversity, and a shared obsession with portraying the truth where no one wanted to see it. As the judicial process progressed, so did the forensic reconstruction of the events. A timeline was established that began with his departure from Ocosingo on the morning of June 11, 1982, continued with his encounter with an anonymous contact at the state highway crossing, and continued with his entry into the Paso de la Tortuga logging trail, where his trail disappeared. That stretch, barely 4 kilometers long, was inspected inch by inch by a multidisciplinary team. Remains of plastic wrapping, rusty shell casings, a broken chain, and a sardine can with a production date of 1981 were found. The site had been inaccessible by vehicle for more than 20 years, which explained why the objects had remained intact under the undergrowth. During the trial, Trejo Escalante agreed to testify in person, which caused a media stir. In the courtroom with a trembling voice, he recounted the details of the kidnapping. He described how the photographers were intercepted by 3 armed men aboard an unmarked pickup truck. He was in the cabin. Carlos tried to resist, even throwing his camera into the bushes, but was beaten to a pulp. Daniela didn't scream, she just asked, Who sent them? The answer never came. They were blindfolded and taken to a clearing in the jungle where a lamb was waiting for them, accompanied by two other men. There they interrogated them for hours. They asked for their tapes, their notebook, their negatives, then forced them to dig a hole. Trejo broke down as he told the ending. They told us not to kill them, just to scare them. But one of the men, the new one, got nervous when she screamed at the sight of the pit. He hit her with the butt. Then everything went fast. I covered them with soil, but I felt it wasn't enough. I took their IDs as proof. I never threw them away. The public prosecutor's office then showed the identification found in the waterproof case. The dried blood samples analyzed by DNA matched Carlos's genetic profile. Silence fell over the room. The judge, visibly moved, ordered the hearing suspended out of respect for the family members present, but the case was not limited to murder. Prosecutor Arteaga sought to demonstrate the institutional framework that allowed the crime and covered it up. A memorandum dated June 28, 1982, signed by Raul Valinas Ordóñez, was found in the archives of the former State Department of the Interior. Then the Delegate of the Interior, where an express recommendation was made to suspend the search for the missing reporters in Montes Azules. His presence would create unnecessary agitation. That leaf, rescued from a dusty, unfoliated file, was key. Although Valinas had died in 2019, the state was forced to acknowledge its moral responsibility for the cover-up. The trial became a mirror of Mexico's recent history: institutional silence, prolonged impunity, selective violence, and systematic neglect. But it also marked a turning point. For the first time, a sentence for enforced disappearance in the context of rural news coverage affected a named direct perpetrator. At the beginning of February, society observed that the court authorized the presentation of new documentary evidence that reinforced the public prosecutor's argument. Carlos and Daniela were not random victims, but rather deliberate targets of a power structure that operated with impunity among security forces, state officials, and local landowners. At the center of that structure was Eustacio Tacho Salmerón Mendez, now deceased, but omnipresent in every page of the file, every testimony, every shadow of the past. With the help of expert historians, prosecutors were able to reconstruct the links between Salmerón and police commanders during the darkest years of the agrarian conflict in Chiapas. Between 1978 and 1985, at least 12 Celtic communities were displaced from their lands through threats, burning of homes, and targeted killings. No case went to trial. In several confidential reports declassified by the National Human Rights Commission, Salmerón was mentioned as a subject of interest linked to rural cleanup operations, a bureaucratic expression used to disguise the dispossession. One of the most striking pieces was the restored recording of an interview with Carlos conducted weeks before his disappearance. In it, she spoke firmly about the risks of her work in the region. There is no declared war here, but there are deaths. What we do with the camera is witness what the paper does not want to write. The video was shown during the fourth day of the trial. The audience, including journalism students, activists, and family members, remained silent as her young and committed face once again lit up a screen after nearly 4 decades. In parallel, the recovered field notebook was analyzed page by page. Among its pages, the experts found a note written in handwriting other than Carlos's. A short penciled phrase, almost illegible due to humidity, was digitally highlighted and read, "Silence is louder than a bullet. It is presumed that Daniela wrote it during the last moments before the kidnapping." That phrase, which became a slogan, began circulating on social media as a symbol of resistance and memory. Social pressure grew to unprecedented levels. Several universities have set up temporary altars with photographs of missing journalists. At UNAM, communication science students held a candlelight vigil. The entrance read, "Carlos and Daniela. We continue looking with your light." The case was no longer local, it was national and was beginning to resonate outside of Mexico. Cordero's defense, exhausted and cornered, attempted to argue senility and cognitive incapacity. They presented a medical report suggesting progressive loss of executive functions and partial amnesia, but the court ordered an independent evaluation. The final diagnosis ruled out dementia. Cordero's memory was working. His silence was voluntary. Judge Avila called an extraordinary session to present the complete forensic findings. There, the experts detailed that both bodies showed signs of having been in a highly acidic environment, which had accelerated decomposition but also preserved some of the evidence. Clothing fibers, film fragments, a religious medal, and a memory card bearing the photo press logo, still sealed inside an airtight case, were recovered. Although no useful information could be extracted from the card, its presence reinforced the claim that both were working on official business and under legitimate credentials. The sentence was handed down on February 28, 2022. The court found Samuel Cordero Utricio guilty of forced disappearance of persons and systematic obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, without benefits or reduction for age. During the reading of the verdict, the judge uttered a phrase that made national headlines. The uniform that should have protected the truth was used to silence it. Today we return to history, what the jungle buried. The final hearing concluded with the symbolic handover of the recovered belongings to the family members. Carlos's camera, Daniela's medal, the field notebook, and the restored negatives. They were placed in display cases in the newly created Archive of Truth for Missing Journalists, inaugurated that same afternoon in Tuxtla Gutierrez. The space was curated by photojournalists of different generations, who chose the photo of the child Teltal as their central image, hugging his mother in front of the burning shack. But the impact was not only legal or institutional. In Celtic communities in the northern region of Ocosingo, elders who had remained silent for years began to share stories. A 78-year-old woman, known as Doña Aurelia, approached a team of anthropologists and said, "I saw the girl taking photos. She crouched down with respect. She was never afraid of our cries." Her testimony, captured on video, was part of the community archive shown during a healing ceremony held under the main ceiba of Nuevo Horizonte, the place where Carlos and Daniela were last seen alive. The Mexican state, through the Ministry of the Interior, offered a public apology to the families in a solemn ceremony at the National Palace. In the ceremony presided over by the Executive Commission for Victim Assistance, excerpts from the last photographs of both photographers were read. At the end, a 10-year-old Celtic girl placed a white rose on the lectern and said in a firm voice, "Thank you for teaching us to see what you don't want us to see." The judicial closure did not mean the end of the memory process. On the contrary, it was the beginning of an even deeper and more lasting stage, reconstruction, symbolic of what Carlos and Daniela left behind in the jungle. In March, the Carlos and Daniela Center for Field Journalists was inaugurated in San Cristobal de las Casas. The building, restored from an abandoned old telegraph station, was converted into a shelter, training room, and archive for reporters working in high-risk areas. At its main entrance, a black marble wall bears an inscription in polished steel letters. By showing the truth, they were silenced. By their light, we speak today. Every corner of the place was designed to speak with silence. The display cases have no titles, only objects. The broken camera, the restored notebook page by page, an enlarged copy of the most emblematic negative, the Teltal child crying in front of the fire, and a map of Chiapas studded with red lights marking areas where journalists, photographers, and defenders still disappear today. In the center of the building is a small, secular chapel without religious images, but with a wooden bench in front of a screen that silently projects the recovered photographs. The most powerful is not the most violent. It is an image in which Daniela holds the camera while Carlos focuses on it. Both are laughing. They are standing on a hill, surrounded by vegetation, still unaware of the ambush that awaited them. It is the last time they are seen alive. The visitor can sit there, observe it, and read the single sentence projected on the side wall. Silence is louder than the bullet. At the national level, the case was included in the final report of the Commission for the Truth and Clarification of Crimes Against the Press in Mexico. It notes that the disappearance of Carlos and Daniela represents one of the most representative attacks of the 20th century against journalists in rural contexts and evidences a pattern of coordinated repression between de facto powers and state institutions. Months later, in Celtic communities of Ocosingo, children began to learn their names. In some schools, teachers organized community photography workshops. Images taken by children appeared on the walls: wrinkled hands, hanging corn cobs, dirt roads, and serene faces. At the bottom of each, an image in childlike handwriting, a simple dedication to Carlos and Daniela, who came to listen to us. In the month of April, when the guayacan trees begin to bloom at the edges of the jungle, Carlos and Daniela's bodies were finally laid to rest. The intimate and serene ceremony took place in the civil cemetery of San Cristobal de las Casas. There were no official speeches, no television cameras, no unnecessary protocols. Only their families, a few aging friends from their youth, representatives of Celtic communities who walked for hours to say goodbye, and a weighty silence that spoke volumes that words couldn't. The urns were placed side by side under a cypress tree that creaks in the wind. Above them, a shared tombstone with their names carved without titles or honorific mentions. Just a date of birth, a date of death, and between them a space that will no longer be empty. In the center, in small letters, was inscribed the phrase that had appeared in the notebook rescued from the jungle: "Silence is stronger than a bullet." As mourners threw handfuls of soil and bougainvillea petals onto the graves, an elderly Celtic woman spoke. She didn't speak Spanish fluently, but didn't need to. She stretched her arm toward the sky and murmured a brief, almost whispered prayer in her own language. Then she took a crumpled photograph from her bag. She herself, 40 years earlier, with her daughter and grandson, captured by Daniela's lens, held it aloft. No one translated it. No one needed it. The story of Carlos and Daniela didn't end with a verdict or a commemorative plaque. Nor did it conclude with a trial or with the viralization of an image. It ended, or perhaps barely began, in the echo of a camera that should never have stopped shooting, in the belated recognition that there are truths the earth cannot swallow forever. Today, every time a young journalist enters a rural community with a notebook and a camera on his shoulder, he is accompanied by his shadow. A shadow that doesn't impose itself, that doesn't shout, but that guides, the shadow of those who decided to look from facing what others preferred not to see. In every photograph that attempts to bear witness to pain, in every chronicle written at risk, in every image recovered from oblivion, Carlos and Daniela exist again. Because in a country where silence has been a weapon, remembering is also a form of justice. Aha.